How y'all, Wyrm here. So I wanted to do a bit of a discussion piece, particularly for the newer players of Final Fantasy XIV regarding the raiding scene we have today and how it got to where it is. I mainly got this idea after explaining to a few friends what raiding was like back during Heavenward. Lastly, this is mainly my personal perspective from playing through that time, so it'll likely differ from person to person. Alright, here we go. I've been playing MMORPGs for a very long time, and I can tell you with each game I've played, the raiding scenes always start off unpredictable, and take the player innovations from older games with similar systems. For Final Fantasy XIV, it's no different. In the beginning, we didn't have ACT or FF logs like we have today, but it didn't take long for ACT to be introduced, but it wasn't fully adopted or required by raiders in A Realm Reborn. But even then, you needed it to test new players to gauge their performance and such, but the raids in A Realm Reborn didn't require massive numbers to clear them. It's by the time of Heavenward comes around that things changed and the system we recognise today came about. So, let's rewind the clock back to 1 week before Alexander Gordias Savage Mode. At this time, players were already gearing up via primal fights such as Ravana and via the normal difficulty Alexander raid. It was the same for me. My group was doing many reruns of primals in normal mode. This was the first time a normal raid system was used for raiding, and it wasn't present in A Realm Reborn, and that model has stayed consistent all the way to the present. Players were preparing for the week ahead, recruiting members for their groups and so on. This is something important though. Back in those days, free company raiding groups were the norm. We had link shells back then of course like we do today, but the majority of groups that raided were in the same FC. So a week passes and Alexander Gordias Savage Mode releases, and groups like mine dive right in right away to take on the challenge. And it was a completely new beast compared to A Realm Reborn. The requirements for killing bosses in these raids were a lot harder. You needed much more DPS and you needed to do the fight almost flawlessly at these early stages. Most groups got stuck on the first boss in A1S, being unable to meet the DPS check, and others struggling with the new mechanics of the fight. This wasn't just casual groups either. Midgore and hardcore groups also struggled with this. Another main thing is changes were also made to tanks and healers in Heavenward, in the form of DPS and healer tank stances. A contrast to A Realm Reborn, which just had tank stances you could toggle on and off. Stance dancing in its true form had come to Final Fantasy XIV. Groups continued to struggle with DPS even after A1S and through A2S, but many groups managed to pass them into A3S. Now, this is where most groups hit the proverbial wall. A3S was a big departure from the fights before, and by many players' estimates it was even harder than A4S, the fight that comes after it. Looking back, I can kinda see where they all come from, but with all the changes we had to make to clear A3S by that time, we started A4S and we were forged into a completely new beast of a group, so we were better prepared for the challenges A4S had to offer. The main issue with A3S was the vast array of mechanics in the fight, combined with the high DPS check. Most groups just couldn't make the check, and combined with the stresses they went through just to get past A1S and A2S to hit this wall, it caused many players to drop out or for entire groups to just utterly disband right then and there. Now, remember I said earlier most groups at this point were actually FC groups? Well, these raids caused most of these groups to disband or reform. And being in the same FC, it caused a fair share of drama and many FCs folded as a result. Players were also still in the mentality that groups were FC based jumped to other FCs as a result. Most groups were having to replace members quickly and reform brand new groups. This is where link shells came into the big picture. Many groups had to reform from members of multiple FCs as they were unwilling to leave their current FCs just for a raid group. But the most common one was FCs just didn't have the raid members in their rosters, and they had to recruit from outside. Link shells is what's allowed this to be possible. The model of link shell raid statics we know today came into the forefront of raiding at this point. It had existed before, but not to the extent of FC groups. I remember watching this unfold as I was tackling A3S and then A4S. It caused so much drama and pain for many players on my server that most of the FCs I recognised disappeared in the first few weeks. Back to raiding however, this is an important bit. I mentioned that tanks and healers were changed. They had DPS stances and healer tank stances. For most groups, particularly the ones shooting for world or server firsts, They had to milk out as much DPS as they could. So they had their tanks, for example, change their gear to include DPS accessories, which was possible during this time as accessories were not bound to jobs at this point. I was a warrior during this time. My group had me in full DPS accessories, which is what most if not all groups were doing at this time. This was the meta that formed. As a result of this caused me to have lower HP. Added on to this, for the most part I wasn't in my tank stance when main tanking, and I only switched to my tank stance for tank busters and such. The rest of the time I was in DPS stance, and combined with my DPS accessories meant I did a lot more damage. But it also meant I took more damage, and with my lower HP due to no tanking accessories, I had a much smaller cushion to sit on. Most of the time, I'd be taking a tank buster, with the proper cooldowns and everything else that I needed, but I'd only have a tiny percentage of HP left for the healers to quickly heal me. This was the new meta of raiding. Tanks and healers were recruited based on their DPS output, rather than their tanking or healing skills. Now this still exists today, but back then they wanted massive numbers from these people. I was an old school tank, been tanking since vanilla WoW. I mastered my cooldowns and I prided myself on taking the least amount of damage and perfectly timing every cooldown that I had. In this new meta, I was a dinosaur. For everyone it was DPS first, tanks second. The same went for healers. Today, we don't need massive numbers from tanks or healers to kill a boss outside of a world or server first. But back then, you needed their max numbers just to clear a raid. At least for most groups, that was the requirement. Now this was a stressful time for most, with many quitting raiding or switching jobs or roles to something a little less stressful. I myself lost many friends from the raiding scene as they quickly got fed up with the requirements and drama, even in casual and mid-core groups. I felt this as well. My group kept putting mad requirements on me to do max DPS, not caring that I was doing my defensive cooldowns perfectly. All they cared for was a high enough DPS percentage. I got so fed up with it that after all that I quit tanking for good during this time. I switched to machinist for the rest of the raid tier. To this day, it leaves me with a horrible taste in my mouth thinking about those times. Now, you might be thinking that I just had a bad apple of a group, and yeah, you're definitely right, my group and its leadership sucked. But many groups had these issues, quickly losing members to the reasons I outlined. Thankfully, by Stormblood, things changed again, and we have the raiding scene we now know today. No more tanks wearing DPS accessories and stance dancing out of pure necessity, just to get enough DPS to kill a boss. A lot of people complain about the system we have today, but to be honest, back then it was much worse. Now, as someone who lived through all this, I can tell you this. The system we have today was also fully inevitable. Gordias just forced the issue. Had it not been for such a wall in Gordias, FC groups may have been the norm a lot longer. But because it was, link shells took their place as the primary group medium a lot quicker. Well everyone, I hope you enjoyed this little ramble of mine about the dark old days of Gordias, as well as the light at the end of the raiding tunnel. Leave a comment with your personal raid stories, particularly if you raided during this time. I'm sure everybody including myself would love to read about your experiences. Leave a like if you enjoyed this content, and hit subscribe to stay tuned for my upcoming videos. Thanks all, and as always, have a good one.